You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
Now at Verizon Business, every business can get the new Samsung Galaxy S25 Plus. Whether you're a new customer, loyal customer, or returning customer, this one's for you, you, and you on America's most reliable 5G network. Get the new Galaxy S25 Plus on us, powered by Verizon Business. 256 gigabyte on us. New device payment purchase agreement, select trade-in, and business unlimited plan required. Credit varies by smartphone trade-in. Applied to account over agreement term up to 36 months. Terms apply. Limited time offer.
Oh, it's such a clutch off-season pickup, Dave.
I was worried we'd bring back the same team.
I meant those blackout motorized shades.
Blinds.com made it crazy affordable to replace our old blinds.
Hard to install?
No, it's easy. I installed these and then got some for my mom. She talked to a design consultant for free and scheduled a professional measure and install.
Hall of Fame son.
They're the #1 online retailer of custom window coverings in the world.
Blinds.com is the GOAT.
Shop Blinds.com right now and get up to 45% off select styles. Rules and restrictions may apply.
You're listening to the We Are Libertarians Network. Find more great shows like this at wearelibertarians.com. Welcome to We Are Libertarians. My name is Chris Spangle. This is an episode of Libertarian Politics and Policy. This is a quick look at the news of the day from a libertarian perspective, and our mission is to help you sound smarter while talking with your friends about politics. We are hosted by the We Are Libertarians Network, and you can find more of our shows at wearelibertarians.com. And today we were talking about the coronavirus. We have Satyajeet Marar from the Reason Foundation and a former director of policy at the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. He's contributed regularly to the Daily Telegraph, Herald Sun, and Spectator in Australia and has been published internationally in The Hill and The Verdict. So thank you for taking some time to talk to us today, Satya. I really do appreciate your time.
No worries. Thanks for having me on.
So the coronavirus is spreading around the world as we speak. It started in China and Wuhan, and it seems to be taking the media by storm. But we want to go beneath the headlines and kind of find out if we should be worried too. So first, let's start with what exactly is the coronavirus?
Sure. So the coronavirus is actually a class of multiple viruses, one of which is the one that causes COVID-19. That's the disease it's linked to. Another one is the virus linked with the SARS epidemic back in 2003. So, coronavirus itself is nothing new, and it's believed to, in this case at least, have originated with, sort of exotic meat markets in, Southeast Asian countries where the hygiene conditions are also not very good. Now, the illness itself, it spreads through similar means as the flu, and it's slightly more contagious than the flu, but not as contagious as measles is. Now, people who carry this illness can often carry it for up to 14 days without showing any symptoms. And the CDC and other organizations have advised to, wash your hands regularly. Don't touch your mouth or your eyes with unwashed hands, and limit your contact with people who seem to show flu-like symptoms. The symptoms include, at a basic level, things like a dry cough, a fever, and a bad cold. Some of the other symptoms include deep fatigue, fever, diarrhea, and so on. So we know that there have been 80,000 cases so far and 3,000 people dead over the world. And while the number of Chinese deaths appears to be reducing, we are hearing of reports from countries like especially Italy and Iran and Japan, where we're seeing a massive ramp up in the number of cases.
Yeah, I saw an article today that like 10% of the Iranian lawmakers have COVID-19. And that's because they have a lot of unrestricted travel between the two countries because of our sanctions on Iran. But how contagious is this? Well, I guess maybe the question is, how much do we really know? Because it started in China, and China seems to be fairly secretive about a lot of stuff, or they seem to be giving more of the better news in some ways. Have they started to give more information, and as it has spread, do we know a little bit more about it that is educating doctors and governments around the world?
Look, we're already hearing reports that the Chinese government has been covering up many key details, including the fact that people were identified with probably this condition well before that information was released. Now, what we've been led to believe is that the death rate in China is about 2.3%. Probably a better indicator is the death rate outside China, which I think, including the Chinese figure right now, sits at about 3.5% of those infected. But the important thing to remember at the moment is that while that figure doesn't seem too high, I mean, it's significantly higher than the flu, common flu, which is 0.1%. It much more severely impacts the elderly, people with pre-existing cardiovascular or lung-related conditions who have a significantly higher mortality rate. If you're young, fit, and healthy, and I guess it's detected in time and treated, your odds are very good. But of course, it probably will involve hospitalization of some sort and a quarantine, which of course is a daunting prospect for most of us. Absolutely.
So the death rate seems low, but is the virality of it higher? Is that why everyone is so concerned?
The virality is higher, but keep in mind there's also this public perception issue, right? A number of countries, including Australia, have put in place travel bans for people coming through China. Some places have immigration bans. And there is a certain degree of public panic. For example, some medical authorities have said if you're quarantined, in the event it actually comes to that, then you should stockpile about 14 days worth of medication, food, and so on. This has led to, in Australia at least, supermarkets being emptied of toilet paper already. So people are panicking quite a lot. Now, what I would say for the United States, though, and this is where the failures and the stupid mistakes of government come into the picture. There already is a diagnostic test for the illness developed by a company in Utah. That test is being used in European countries already. Now, that test has not been used in the United States. The FDA has instead used another test developed by the government, which was flawed. And they've limited their testing to people who have either traveled from the associated countries or who have been in contact with those who have. Now, as we know, you can carry this for about 2 weeks before showing any symptoms, which means that we may not fully know just how bad the threat is to the USA for at least a week or 2 weeks. And that's assuming that these diagnostic kits are deployed at the same rate the government says they will be.
So when you hear the diagnostic test, what exactly does that mean? Because I don't really understand what that means.
It's basically a way to test to see if someone is actually carrying the virus.
Is it blood or saliva, or how do they test for it?
I'm not entirely sure on those details. Okay. I do know that it is transmittable through air particles that would include saliva. Something more severe, like Ebola, for example. Ebola, when that outbreak happened in West Africa, had a much higher mortality rates, but it was also a lot harder to transmit. That involved blood or fluid contact. We know that with this particular, coronavirus, that it is transmittable through being even in proximity with people who might be carrying it, and they might appear to be completely healthy.
So, living in Indiana, 3 minutes from a hospital and having health insurance and being 36 and healthy, I don't know that I'm necessarily hearing a reason to panic. I don't know if you saw the video. Just go to Twitter and look up Costco panic, and it was over the weekend. I mean, it was hundreds of people lined up outside of a Costco. I'm not lining up outside of Costco based on this information. So why do you think that it hits people in a certain way where they're driven to go out and buy, when really, like, you're probably going to catch the flu long before you ever catch COVID-19?
Well, I think it's part of the side effect of living in a modern world where we really don't have too much to worry about, and we do have such a good safety net in place that when something like this comes up on the horizon, the mere specter of it and the mere potential that it could turn out to be a lot worse than it initially seems to be, is probably enough to make people panic and think, okay, look, just in case, I'm going to go ahead and do this. Because the last thing you want is to be in the kind of situation that a lot of the Chinese have ended up in, which is that, the sudden imposition of quarantine very strict measures meant that a number of people were unable to contact their elderly relatives in time, who ended up dying, or disabled children and so on. Pets were left unfed. Some of them died. That sort of scary situation that we saw play out in China, where the government is very authoritarian and really clamped down on this, I think also instills a certain amount of fear, because technically under the law, the U.S. government and state authorities do have the power, in a worst-case scenario, to impose measures that aren't as severe but are, pretty strict in terms of quarantine. And I guess that is a very scary idea for most people. That is a huge disruption for daily life.
I know some people may bristle when I ask this, but do you think I mean, Ebola was very scary. I remember being a kid, younger, when that was going on. I'm not sure how old you are, but I was like 10, so I was sure I was going to get Ebola and die. And then, Dustin Hoffman's in space suits, and I'm like, oh man, it's really going to hit. And the death rate, as far as I understand, for Ebola is like 1 in 3. So it's a very lethal disease. But I don't know anybody who's ever gotten West Nile, Ebola, the swine flu, or any of these things. So really, at the end of the day, people need to just do basic preparations, right? Wash their hands, don't touch your face, just be careful. But at the end of the day, you're probably going to be safe if you're one of our listeners.
What makes a great pair of glasses? At Warby Parker, it's all the invisible extras without the extra cost. Their designer quality frames start at $95, including prescription lenses, plus scratch-resistant, smudge-resistant, and anti-reflective coatings, and UV protection, and free adjustments for life. To find your next pair of glasses, sunglasses, or contact lenses, or to find the Warby Parker store nearest you, head over to warbyparker.com. That's warbyparker.com.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. During tax season, your personal info travels to a lot of places. Between payroll, your tax consultant, and the IRS. If your W-2 gets exposed, that's just the ticket for identity thieves. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it guaranteed or your money back. Don't let identity thieves take you for a ride. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Yeah, at least that's how it seems right now. This is one of those situations where, in all probability, this is massively overblown, and a state of normalcy can come back to the country and the world, over the next few months. However, given the fact that there hasn't been a full rollout of, diagnosis for this sort of thing beyond a very limited window, and there won't be for another few weeks, there's just a question mark hanging there at the moment. And inevitably, where there is a question mark, people are going to panic slightly. There has been some pretty big disruption economically. A number of countries, of course, have their supply chains in China. And while the number of, and I emphasize the word reported, cases in China has dropped significantly, they're still, their economy has slowed down to a complete crawl. And a number of companies are already looking to shift their operations, their supply chains elsewhere, which I think is a good thing in the long run in terms of minimizing risk exposure. We do know that a lot of pandemics throughout history, both recently with the SARS case and historically with things like the bubonic plague and so on, originated in that region of the world and spread very quickly through the trade routes. What we, as libertarians certainly don't want to see is industries who did not, or companies who did not plan ahead for such risks, demanding bailouts from the taxpayer, like what's happening in Australia, where universities and the tertiary education sector have been badly hit by the travel restrictions, and they're asking for government handouts. But really, it's one of the vagaries of risks that comes with life, and it's not the job of the government, of course, to bail you out for not planning ahead for such, eventuality.
Well, yeah, that's one of the challenges of, I think, being a libertarian, because you want free markets and you want to expand your territory. But at the same time, you look at the security risks of the United States military, for instance, has their antibiotics produced in China. And what we saw with the masks being produced in China is China just kept the masks. So it doesn't seem to be a very secure supply chain if we're really over relying on China. So how much do you think this, do you think it's a slight blip and in 6 months everybody will forget about it? Or do you think that companies are really going to take a serious look at diversifying where they're creating things and maybe even bring jobs back to America and maybe charge a little more to diversify their risk?
Oh, they already are, and they definitely will. And what's interesting is it probably won't even necessarily involve having to move production back home and charging a lot more money. A number of countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and so on are already, seeing a large influx of production infrastructure and investment and so on in response to not just this recent disease happenings, but in response to the wider issue of trade tensions with China, the tariff wars and so on. It's just a way for companies to, I guess, mitigate their risk. And there's also the fact that, look, the Chinese, their living standards have gone up so much, in recent years that that has led to them demanding higher wages, right? And they have a smaller population. They're going to have an aging population issue in the long term because of their history of the one-child policy. So there are a number of reasons for companies to switch. With the USA, I think one of the biggest beneficiaries of recent happenings would be Mexico. NAFTA was recently renegotiated. A number of companies already moving their manufacturing, from China into Mexico, where, besides issues like the cartel violence and law and order situation, cost of manufacturing and transport to the USA in some cases is lower. And it takes, only a few days to move a product from a factory in Mexico to the US. It takes about 14 days sometimes to get that moved from China. And look, I don't know about you, but one of my biggest concerns that I've seen are these private companies who, become afraid to call out the Chinese government for their authoritarian behavior, the human rights abuse, the organ harvesting. We've seen Blizzard Entertainment go as far as punish gamers for simply expressing political opinions because they're worried about being shut out of China overnight. And, as far as I'm concerned, of the private sector, becoming a bit more skeptical of China and diversifying into other countries is a good thing.
I completely agree, because while I am a non-interventionist, I don't believe that China is a good actor on the world stage. I do think things like Belt and Road, where they're investing in infrastructure, does pose a long-term threat to really Western nations and free market nations, may be the better way to put it, because China, if this is all being used as a convenient excuse to re-examine business and say, maybe we ought to start looking elsewhere and stop supporting a regime that will imprison 2 million Muslims and, just raise churches left and right and isn't really free and we're supporting them, I'm okay with it. I personally, because I'm willing to pay a little bit more or slightly more or support companies that choose not to do business with China, because I just don't trust China has any inkling of freedom. They seem more bent on domination than freedom. Not that we're perfect, but at the same time, we don't have concentration camps for religious and political prisoners.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things with Chinese model that has made it so effective is that they've combined aspects of capitalism with aspects of top-down state control. To the point where, they're really hardcore mercantilists in some ways. Most of their top companies have a close relationship with either the government or people connected to the government, which makes it very easy for them to simply shut companies out for their CEO saying or doing the wrong thing. We've seen them wantonly arresting and throwing into jail business executives who, foreign nationals who stay there and have said or done the wrong thing, or, have been a victim of their justice system, which isn't always the most respectful to fair and due process and so on. And look, one of the theoretical reasons why we've seen China actually become more authoritarian as they become more prosperous is I think that people ultimately are willing to trade away, as rational actors, a certain amount of liberty for being kept happy, having a roof over their head, having a good job, and so on. And that economic development has been used to offset some of the government's increasing overreach. But keep in mind, if China faces a competitive threat from other countries around the world, if their ability to, wield their power and attract all this investment and so on is challenged by other countries who are able to offer something better in a less authoritarian environment, then that also makes it harder for them to justify their own people the level of authoritarianism that they're engaging in. And this is only in theory. We haven't seen this play out in practice. But I think if there is an actual serious threat to China's economic dominance from competition, then that will lead to increasing demands for the government to treat its own people better.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us. If people would like to follow you, and you talk about a lot of different things, not just public health, but tax reform, technology, foreign relations. People would like to follow you. Where can they do that?
So my Twitter handle is @Mr. Jeet, MisterJeet. And you can find some of my writings also on reason.org. I write on a number of topics, education, finance, tech, foreign affairs, consumer choice, and so on.
Satya Marar, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right, thank you for listening to We Are Libertarians, and we will talk to you soon. You're listening to the We Are Libertarians Network, and you can find more great shows like this at wearelibertarians.com. Shows like We Are Libertarians with Chris Spangle, The Brian Nichols Show, The Boss Hog of Liberty, Now Hear This with Chris Spangle, Gingerarchy with Tricia Stewart-Mann, and our training podcast, Upward, Libertarian Activism. All of these shows are supported by our patrons. If you'd like to become a Patreon member, visit wearelibertarians.com. Thank you so much for listening to this show